Welcome back. Got a good one for you today. I've been following the same news groups and things, chat rooms in Facebook and all that sort of stuff. I've been following them for years, and the same questions always come up. How do I get a cassette deck working or not? I'm going to walk you through a logical process, and at the end of this video you will know where you're coming from. This is my own thoughts on it. You can see in the background on my screen here there is a Sony. Now that's over in the back there on that shoulder. So there is a Sony, which I have, and I think that's a Sony. And on my other shoulder you can see here, that is a teac W1200, and down there, down there is a turntable I've got, which is 35 years old, and on that side, it gets confusing, on that is a Soundmaster or a Behringer, one or the other, monitor PA. And so, you know, I've been involved with the odd bit of stuff, but what irritates me when I'm looking in these groups and things is people come up and they ask the same questions, and then sometimes it's a bit like, well, let's just see if I ask a question, see what answer I get. The most common one is you start off and it says, I've just got this thing from Goodwill, charity shop, guy down the road who's passed away and his family are giving it away, etc., etc. And it's got a cassette deck, and it's from the 90s. It's going to be between 25 and 30 years old. So they say, well, is it good for anything? Well, yes, it is, probably. And depending on the brand, it could be very good. If it's a Nakamichi or a Tandberg or any of those sort of things, you know, it could be very good. And then they start asking questions, and the normal question is, what do I need to do with it first? Well, the answer to that is, you've got to see if it works. When I used to do this sort of thing for a living, if you had something that was really old that was given to you, you'd ramp up the power supply on a variac transformer, which would allow you to bring it up gently so that there weren't any nasty explosions, but most people don't have those. If you plugged it in and it's working, because you've bought it from Goodwill, say, and or from a charity shop in the UK, and they say, oh, yeah, if it doesn't work, bring it back. Well, fine. Okay, so you plug it in, and it goes, whoa, click, 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 and you think, well, maybe it's okay, but I've not paid a lot of money for it. Then you try putting a tape in it, and if you're lucky, it doesn't chew the tape. If you're unlucky, it does chew the tape, if you've got a tape. But you should have got one of those when you picked up the machine. The normal cause of that is either dirty heads, dirty pinch rollers, and the belt's not working properly. So first thing you should do, of course, is switch it on and try playing no tape. See if the bits work, see what bits don't work, see if the rewind, see if it fast forwards, and if it does, then you can try putting a tape in, but don't put in a tape in that's got any value. If you put in a tape having cleaned the pinch roller and the heads with something like a Q-tip, as seems to be the favourite name for them, but a cotton bud or an earbud, whatever you want to call it, and a bit of alcohol. If you haven't got any rubbing alcohol, 99% isopropyl or anything like that, then you could literally use a bit of scotch or something similar, or meths. You're not going to be bathing it in it, you're just going to be using it to get rid of any sticky residue. So that's all you want to do. Quick brush over with some alcohol over the heads, over the pinch roller, and having made sure that everything's moving, try putting a tape in it. If you're lucky at this point, the thing will jump into life and the VU meters will move, or the displays will move, and you're up and running. If you're unlucky, it's going to chew the tape, or it's going to sit there, or it's going to do nothing. Now at this point, this is where people start getting onto the groups and saying, my cassette deck I've got is doing this, that or the other. One of the common ones is it's only playing on one channel, and the other common one is it sounds muffled. Well, the muffled is normally, it's either going to be one of three things. Either you didn't clean the heads properly, or the heads are damaged. The tape isn't tracking correctly over the heads, or maybe, just possibly, the head's out of alignment. Most people leap for the head out of alignment thing. This is not the one to go for. This is the last thing you should go for. Look at the heads, see if the heads are actually in well, see if they're still sealed, see if they look like they're straight. Do not grab a screwdriver and start poking it, because A, you could damage it, and B, you could misalign it, and if there's nothing wrong with it to start with, why do you want to break it? You've bought this and you want to get it working. If it's muffled, clean it, and then clean it again. Make sure the tape that you're running through it, make sure that it's running smoothly. Have a look and see if the tape has got wrinkled edges or creases in it. If it has, then that's what your problem is. The tape is running off true. If it hasn't, then maybe there's something else. Most common problem then would be the record switches. These are fitted, depending on the machine. They're normally they're normally about, if you look at a pen, they're normally about that long, as in about that long, and they've got a thing on them, and it's soldered to the inside of the board. So to do this, you're going to have to take the lid off it and look inside. Now, if you've never looked inside a cassette deck, if it's a modernish one, one of the later ones, it's going to have hardly anything in there. If it's one of the earlier ones, or if it's something like a Nakamichi or a Tamberg, it's going to be absolutely jam-packed full. This is going to scare the crap out of you, because if you're not into this sort of thing, you're going to look in there and think, oh my God, something crawled in there and died and spat out all this wire or things. This is not this is not going to help. But look for the switches. If you can see the switches there, you can actually operate them manually. You can just sort of shove them with your finger gently. You must never push anything firmly or hard, because you'll break things. One of the problems with people trying to repair cassette decks or any electronics is that if they're old, the wires will be brittle. And by brittle I mean stiff. They won't have moved for a while. They could be cold. Doesn't matter why they're stiff, but they're going to be stiff. And if you start pulling them around, almost invariably, because they're old, they will, one or two of them will snap or will damage the board they're mounted on and will cease to work properly. This is where most people come unstuck. And if you're not equipped with a soldering iron and the ability to put the things back in the right places, then the cassette deck's not going to work. So don't go pulling the wires about. Don't go shoving things firmly out of the way. Be very gentle. If it is the switches, then you should get some crackling and maybe it'll clear itself up. If it isn't the switches, then you won't get any particular benefit. Ideally, you should put some what's called deoxit or contact cleaner. Do not, and I repeat this, do not use WD-40, the stuff that you use on your car to get through the puddles. This will do nothing but damage to the machine. At the best, it will do nothing, and at worst, it will actually make the machine unusable. So do not use WD-40, but if you can find some contact cleaner, then use that. That will do the job quite nicely. You spray the switches and then you go back and try again. At this point, as a novice looking into it, you've done probably most of that you can do. If you find that the belts, right, so that's hopefully now working and you're up and running. If you find that it is actually, go back to the previous step, bits, you can hear a motor running, but you cannot see anything moving, then you're looking at probably the belts. Now the belts will have melted or will have fallen off or just stretched. Depends on exactly what model you got, and it depends on what belts they were fitted with and how long ago, and if they've ever been changed. Some belts are 45 years old and working perfectly. Some belts are 25 years old and turned into goo. So this is where you then have to decide whether you can start replacing belts. If you do replace belts, be careful, because they are very, very difficult to replace. They have a habit of dissolving and stretching and falling off, and you have to try and get the tracking right. Having done all that, at the end of the day, if you've got the tape moving and you've got the things clean, you should have a working cassette deck, and that's the point where you should be happy. Now's the time to have a quick recap on what we've done so far. Previously, I was talking to you about picking up a cassette deck, finding that there was a problem with it, and sort of a way to look at it. Now, I'm assuming that this is somebody who has not got a history of working on cassette decks. Because if you are, then you've done everything and it's all up and running. You've either flipped it or you've put it in your collection. If you're like a normal person who has just decided that you're interested in cassette decks, you've wandered into a shop and there's one there, and you've bought it. It may or may not have been working when you took it home, then, or now you discovered a couple of days later that it's not as good as maybe you hoped it was going to be, because, like I said before, you've had channels down or whatever. Well, that's fine. So you've done looking to see whether the belts were okay, looking to see if things were pulling in the right direction, and looking to see if they were clean. Now, having decided that you've got one that the belts are needing changing, and as I explained to you, if they're rubbery, some of the neoprene will decide that it's just going to dissolve. And the problem with that is that it's just gone. It turns into a goo. It resembles sort of tar or setting rubber glue. It's horrible stuff. And at the end of using this thing, you're going to find that it's not particularly good. So you might have to change them. If you're lucky, you've got belts that have just gone slack. That's fine, because slack belts you can just undo, and you can see where they came from. Problems with changing belts. This is where I was going to go with this. It's belts are invariably threaded through the general metalwork of the cassette deck. Now, if you've got one of the new tension type mechanisms, when I say new, that means anything up to 30 years old, they were often just one belt, and that belt was threaded round the motor and round the capstan, and that was it. Everything else was driven off either gears or idler tyres, which are sort of rubber tyres, neoprene tyres. Changing those belts, very easy. If you've got yourself a boombox or something like that, very often it's just 4 or 5, 6 maybe screws to just remove a plate, and you can replace the belt. One of the most common problems with belts on cassette decks is the take-up drive, and that's sort of on some of the higher end decks. You'll have a belt that runs to the take-up pulleys and things. The other thing that you have a lot of problems with is, believe it or not, a very important belt is the counter belt. On most cassette decks there is a tape counter. Now on some cassette decks that's literally looks like the numbers in an old Speedo. On other ones it's actually numbers on a proper illuminated display. If we were looking at the thing that's behind me on that side, W1200, around about there, you can see there is a tape counter on there. Those are driven by a belt normally to a pulse generator, and they are part of the auto stop mechanism. So they serve two purposes. They allow the machine to tell you how far the tape has run, and they also tell the machine that the tape is running. So if you've got a decent deck, something more like this one, some people will call decent, if you've got a decent deck with an electronic or a mechanical counter, there's a good chance that that's doing more than one job. And if that belt is slack, or if the counter stops running for any other reason, you will end up with the problem that it will just stop. Now, the most common problem is the belt is a bit slack, and if it gets a little bit, maybe the weather changes, believe it or not, these things are very often dependent upon things like humidity. Maybe the weather will change, and so all of a sudden you'll start having the machine will just stop, just for no apparent reason. And you start it up again and it works again for a while, and then it'll just stop again. And that's normally what it is. You have to change that belt. Now, the reason I'm going on about belts is because if you go onto something like a Facebook group and say, got a problem, the first thing they're going to shout is belts. And more often than not, they'll be right. But you've got to get yourself, ideally, a belt kit. Look on eBay, find out where you can get the proper belt kit from, if you can, because they will probably fit properly. That doesn't mean that every supplier is honourable, but there's a good chance that if they've got a good feedback, then they've supplied some good kits, in which case the belts should just fit. Then you get the problems. Now, I said earlier on you got the problem of all the wires. Wires are stiff things. They just, you start off with something that looks like that, all nice and flexible. You leave that 40 years, and it's not flexible anymore. Now, if the wires are going to fall off, you're going to have to put them back on again. So you have to be, if you're going to do anything other than just sort of nudge things out of the way, first advice, take some photographs. Take pictures of where things are. That's not things that you necessarily want to know about, but things that you might need to know about. So take pictures of everything. Take pictures of where the wires run, take pictures of where they don't run. Make sure that you can see where the bits of mechanism go, like the thing that pushes the record switches we were talking about earlier. That's normally a metal bar, but on posh cassette decks, they'll still have the switch, but they'll have a solenoid, which is an electronic plunger, an electronically driven plunger, which will actually operate the record and playback switches. On really posh machines, they don't have those. They have electronic switches, which are totally electronic, and you can't see them, but we're not worried about those. If you've got any of those sort of things, you need to know where things run. You need to know where wires do go, where wires don't go, where bits of pusher go and where they don't go, and which side of a pole things go. With the belts, you've got to look, and I mean, that Sony that I was talking about, which is the one, that Sony, that has got I think it's about 4 belts in it. I can't remember now. It took ages to fit. But the reason why it was a problem, and I'll tell you for why, it's because it had a counter belt, so that's one. It had, I think it was take-up belts, so that was 2 and 3. So the pulleys were driven from it. And also it had the capstan belt, so 2, 3, 4. And there might well have been another one, just I can't remember. But the mechanism, these belts were put over 3 layers of metal. So you had layer of metal, and then another layer of metal. So 3 layers of metal, boom, boom, boom. And the belts, the pulleys, are within those 3 layers. And you had to take them apart, and there's I don't know, 150 bits attached to the plates in various ways. There's a method. You had to get the manual for it. If you haven't got the manual for it, don't attempt it, because it's just a mess. But it's one of the easier ones to do. So believe me, if you do anything like this, you need a manual. If you get the really simple ones, the tennis ones, yeah, you can do that without a manual. Or if you've got the experience, you can do it without a manual. But if you're looking at this from a start point, particularly the Sony ones are particularly good at melting the belts. So you have to work out which way the mechanism spins and spools, which side of the pulley the actual belt goes. Is it on the outside, or is it on the far side, or the near side? That sort of thing. You have to work out the rotations, and very often on different decks they'll go through intermediate rotations. So every time it goes through a pulley, normally the pulleys go in the same direction, but if it goes via idlers, then you get reversal of direction. You have to work all this sort of thing out. This is easy to do. It's time consuming. You get it wrong and you've got to take the thing apart again. It's just one of those things. But don't go fiddling with the heads. Now, having got the belts on, now I did not, on my Sony, I did not change the pinch roller. For the simple reason the pinch roller that was on it was fine, but I did get one in the kit. But to try and get to it would have been another, I don't know, not easy, because the mechanism for the pinch roller was mounted from behind, and it wasn't a very easy. Anyway, I didn't change it, and I've still got the pinch roller tucked underneath the deck in its little plastic bag for use when I do need it. It's a very nice deck, that Sony. There is a video on my channel about it, and yeah, I say it was very time consuming, but it was very well worth it. This hobby of cassettes works in 2 ways. You've got listening to the music, and you've got listening to the equipment. If you're a listening to the equipment person, then you'll probably enjoy tweaking it and adjusting stuff. But if you're a listening to the music person, you probably just want to be able to get on and do it. Now, the other thing that people always ask is, should I demagnetize the heads? This is a bone of contention with a lot of people. Heads mostly do not need demagnetizing. That is to say, if they get magnetized, they need to be demagnetized. But how do you do that? Well, it's a bit like the old thing about, do you remember the Crocodile Dundee film, where the guy being held up by a punk with a knife, and the guy says, "Give me your money, because I've got a knife." And Crocodile Dundee pulls out a knife that says, that's not a knife, this is a knife, and he's got this whopping great big blade, and whoa, yeah. Right. There is a video on my channel of the wand that is available. They're available from Amazon. In fact, whilst I'm talking to you, I'll see if I can find one. And they're available from eBay, and they are very good. They are not to be played with willy-nilly. The trouble with degaussing wands, that's what they're called. This is one of the problems with electronics and technical stuff. I see now I've put in demagnetizing wand, and it's now come up and found a degaussing for arcade monitor, CRT television check. Funnily enough, they haven't got the one that I had originally. I'll just show you what has come up. This is what has come up. This is, you see, I told you, I typed in up the top there, tape head demagnetizing wand, and it's come up with degausser, which is what I put in the first place. But this is for TVs. This is for making your normal TV, get rid of the colour patterns that you have on them. But it hasn't got a tape head degausser on there. Search for anything. Degausser. No, demagnetizer. And it's come up with the same one as on there, as on Amazon. But anyway, looking down here, see if we can find anything similar to what I'm actually looking for. They are available, they're just not available here. It would appear. Let's try and go back up again. This is obviously UK, because that's where I am. Tape head demagnetizer one. Let's see what comes up with that. Well, I've got one there, which it shows as being, well, it's not exactly what I was looking for. That's an American one anyway, so that's not what we want. This is the sort of thing that they sell. Now, a tonal tape head demagnetizer for reel-to-reel and tape recorders, 220 volts, thereabouts. Because this happens to be obviously for the UK, which is what we have, is 220 volts. And that basically, I'll tell you what that is. That is a coil. That's a big length of coiled wire, and down the middle of it is that metal thing there. Now that will take the magnetic field out of the coil and will allow you to apply it to locations. As you can, I don't know if you can see on there. If you went for it today, there is a special offer on it. It's only 19 quid. Anyway, that's that. What I will say is that these are dangerous. Not dangerous as in they're going to set fire to you, but dangerous as in they're not going to do what you want them to do. Back to me. Okay, so you've seen the wand. That's what everybody's all trying to buy and they're trying to use, and they're very, very powerful if you get a good one. And what that will do is that will totally and utterly screw your heads if you don't use it right. If you use it correctly, and there's a very good description by a chap on the Facebook page, Cassette Decks Bracket Vintage, and there is somebody who's asked a question, should I demagnetize the heads on my machine? It works fine. Should I demagnetize them? The answer is no, because if they're working fine, leave them alone. The only advantage of demagnetizing heads is if they're magnetized, if you demagnetize them, they will actually work better. But if they're not magnetized and you try and demagnetize them, at best you're going to have no effect at all because there's nothing wrong with them, and at worst you're going to magnetize them because these things are, there is a degree of practice to make them work properly. You can't just pick one up and make it work. It doesn't work that way. It is not practical. It is a skill. Now, you can practice on other bits of metal, and if you've really got a problem with your cassette deck, you can then use it. But the problem is, if you just pick it up and wander it around, if you don't do it correctly, you can damage all sorts of things. You've got to do, as it was pointed out in the thread, you've got to demagnetise not only the head but also the tape transport. That's the guides and everything else. You must be careful not to magnetise. You've got to switch the thing on a distance away. You've got to move it in gently. You've got to do the right sweeping motion, and you've got to take it away gently, and then you've got to turn it off. You've got to make sure you don't magnetise anything else whilst you're doing it, and people don't actually know how far away they should be. I can't actually advise you. I've done it a couple of times. I'll tell you what, I've got one of those ones, and I've got a machine, and I have not actually switched it on and used it on one of my machines because I don't want to have the problem of ruining the heads. Now, if I can't do it after 40 years, happily, just as a make sure, then I don't think anybody who is just getting into cassettes ought to be doing it. But that doesn't mean that the heads don't need demagnetising. It just means that most heads don't need demagnetising. There are some brands of cassette deck which will use certain heads which, a DCC for instance, if you try and demagnetise those, they will apparently damage the heads. And I think it's some techniques, but don't quote me on that, but there is allegedly, I have read, and you know what I think about stuff on Facebook. You have to be careful about what you read, but it is allegedly some cassette brands, some particular models, that if you try and demagnetise them, you'll destroy the heads. So, if you're going to get yourself a cassette deck from a thrift store, and it's cost you $5, and you want to try out using a demagnetizer, well, fine, it's going to cost you $5 if it all goes wrong. But if you've got anything that's if you've just spent 3 or 4 hours putting belts in it and it's all working tickety-boo, and you think, oh, I'll just demagnetise the heads just to make sure, and then it doesn't work probably afterwards, well, more fool you. That's all I can say. It is not really there's a label on the back of most of these things. It says no user serviceable parts inside. They are a legal thing, but they sort of have a clue that it's not made to be easy. Other than that, working on cassette decks is great fun if you're into doing the electronics, but make sure you've got the equipment. If you want to do, one of the things people often say about is recapping them, which is true, you can recap them and you can make them work very well. But if you change all the capacitors in a cassette deck, you've got possibly 100 capacitors, there's 200 joints, you've got to solder, you've got to pull the wires apart, and then when you put it back together again, you've got to hope that it all works, hence the photographs that were needed earlier on. And believe me, wires just fall off, so you do need to know where they go. And having done all that, you've then got to calibrate it. Try and find proper calibration cassettes, try and find proper calibration equipment. It is not easy. If you start mucking about with this stuff, this is where the things about the heads come in. If you play with the azimuth, the chances are, if your heads are clean and sealed, if the paint or the lacquer that they lock the heads with is still intact, there is no point altering the azimuth. It's probably not wrong, and if it sounds okay, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If, on the other hand, the screws have been altered, then maybe you will need to adjust it. But in order to do that properly, you need very expensive equipment. You need tapes, you need scopes, and you need the time to do it. And you need the instruction book, because each manual will tell you slightly differently. On the other hand, you can just get a high-pitched tape or something that's been done. You can just get a high-pitched tape, and you can just get something that's got a lot of symbols and a lot of high. You can adjust it on that, and you may be able to get a reasonable result. And you could use a phone as a signal analyzer. It all depends on how far you want to go. If you go onto some of these groups, you'll find that people will be telling you that's a load of rubbish and you can't do it, and then other people will be saying, yeah, that's fine. The other thing that you're going to have problems with is setting speed. If you change the belts, you've got to check the speed. Now, the trouble with speed is you need a proper calibrated tape to be able to do that, or you need to have some methods of doing it. there are various videos on the internet, including my channel, which will give you a way of doing it, which may or may not work. And there are some ways I've got on my channel which really don't. I've done them to see, because people have said, "Oh, do it this way," and I've done them to see if it's any good. And some of them, people have got no idea. And there's one guy who reckons that you should actually mark a tape, run it for an amount of time, mark it, and then actually measure how much tape has cut. So pull the tape out of the cassette and measure how much has run, and then you can work out with the maths how fast or how slow the tape is running. That is obviously physically possible, but do you want to do that? And when you've done it, how do you know it's, well, anyway, there are various other methods, but what you should ideally do is run a tape that is a proper tone that you've bought, and it will play back at the correct speed. And if it doesn't, then you can measure it with a phone and you can hear that the errors are there. Anyway, as I say, there are various channels have got how to set your speed on them. Mine has got 2 or 3 different methods, and it's worth having a look at that. Other than that, cassette decks are fun. The tapes will jam up. You will get chewed tapes, and you will get recordings that are disappointing you because the tape was shed. All of these problems are really down to the tapes, and they are not directly connected to the machine, but you do have to keep the machine clean. Anyway, I think I've rambled on enough there, so you've got any problems, genuinely, if you put questions on the comments, I will try and answer them. And if I can't answer them, I'll try and point you to people who can. It's a good hobby. It's a fun hobby. Don't let it stress you out. The world isn't really that complicated, so let's keep it simple. Anyway, this could be the start or the end of a journey. If you've got any experiences you'd like to share, put them in the comments below. Like, subscribe, catch you again. Bye-bye.